Since the Federal Reserve is the engine of inflation, creates the business cycle, produces our recessions and our depressions, the Federal Reserve obviously is a very important issue. And fortunately tonight we have a former director of the Federal Reserve at Kansas City. So I have a question for Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, in the past, you've been rather critical of any of us who would want to audit the Fed. You said you've used pretty strong terms that we were ignorant and that we didn't know what we were doing. And therefore, there was no need for a Fed audit anyway, because if you had one, you're not going to find out everything because everybody knows everything about the Fed. But now that we have found and we've gotten an audit, we have found out an awful lot on how special businesses get, bailed out. Wall Street, the banks and special companies, foreign governments. And you said that you advised those of us who were concerned and you belittled, you say, call up the Federal Reserve and just ask them to get a PR person. So do you still stick by this, that this is frivolous, or do you think it's very important? 64% of the American people want a full audit of the Fed on a regular basis.
Mr. Kane.
First of all, you have misquoted me. I did not call you or any of your people ignorant. I don't know where that came from.
I'll get it for you.
All right? Now, so you got to be careful of the stuff that you get off the internet, because that's just not something that I have said.
Some people say that we ought to audit the Federal Reserve. Here's what I do know. The Federal Reserve already has so many internal audits, it's ridiculous. I don't know why people think we're going to learn this great amount of information by auditing the Federal Reserve. Now, I no longer serve on the board of the Federal Reserve. I'm not being defensive of the Federal Reserve. In fact, some of the policies and some of the actions of the Federal Reserve today, I don't agree with, because the attitude and the non-politicization of the Federal Reserve in the 90s when I served on it is totally different than what's going on today. But that's another matter. But people who say, well, we ought to audit the Federal Reserve because we don't know enough about it. Well, here's the advice I've given to people who are worried about an audit of the Federal Reserve. Call them up and ask them if you can stop by and have one of their PR people or one of their public relations people explain to you how the Federal Reserve operates. I think a lot of people are calling for this audit of the Federal Reserve because they don't know enough about it. There's no hidden secrets going on in the Federal Reserve to my knowledge. And I tell people, we've got 12 Federal Reserve banks. You find out which district you're in, call them up and go from there. We don't need to waste money with another commission or an audit that's not necessary. Because, folks, we got a lot of other problems we need to worry about. You're listening to the Neil Boortz Show, and this is Herman Cain.
Secondly, when I served on the board of the Federal Reserve in the 1990s, we didn't do any of the things that this Federal Reserve is doing. I don't agree with the actions of this Federal Reserve. I don't agree with the actions that have been undertaken by Ben Bernanke. We didn't have a $14 trillion national debt to prop up with some of the actions that they're taking. And I have also said, to be precise, I do not object to the Federal Reserve being audited.
We don't need to waste money with another commission or an audit that's not necessary.
I simply said, if someone wants to initiate that action, go right ahead.
Here's the advice I've given to people who are worried about an audit of the Federal Reserve. Call them up.
It doesn't bother me. So I've been misrepresented in that regard. I don't have a problem with the Federal Reserve being audited. It's simply not my top priority. My top priority is 999. Jobs, jobs, jobs.
Congressman Paul, you called his plan dangerous today.
Oh, it is, because it raises revenues, and the worst part about it is it's regressive. A lot of people aren't paying any taxes, and I like that. I don't think that we should even things up by raising taxes. So it is a regressive tax, so it's very, very dangerous in that thing, and it will raise more revenues. But the gentleman asked the question, he didn't even ask what we're talking about. He asked the question, what are you going to replace the income tax with? And I say nothing. That's what we should replace it with. But I do want to make a point that spending is a tax. As soon as the government spends money, eventually it's a tax. Sometimes we put a direct tax onto people, sometimes we borrow the money, and sometimes we print the money. And then when prices go up, like today, the wholesale price index went up 7% rate. And if you look at the free market, the prices are going up 9 and 10%. So that is the tax. So spending is the tax. That is the reason I offered the program to cut $1 trillion out of the first year of budget.
You've said about taxation, in a way that doesn't mince his words, the following. Taxation is immoral, you told the Libertarian Party News. Would you scrap the tax code altogether?
That'd be a pretty good idea, pretty good start. I can qualify it if I'm allowed. Taxation is theft. When you take money from one group to give it to another, when you transfer the wealth. Now, taxation could be accomplished with user fees and, highway fees and gasoline taxes and import taxes. But the income tax is based on the assumption that the government owns you, owns all your income, and provides the conditions on which they allow you to keep a certain percentage. That, to me, is immoral, and the founders didn't like it. That's why the Constitution had to be amended in 1913.
So which Federal Reserve chairman over the last 40 years do you think has been most successful and might serve as a model for that appointment?
Alan Greenspan.
Why?
Because that's when I served on the board of the Federal Reserve in the early 1990s. And the way Alan Greenspan oversaw the Fed and the way he coordinated with all of the Federal Reserve banks, I think that it worked fine back in the early 1990s. Now, on that same point, I have already identified two candidates, which I cannot give their names, to replace Mr. Bernanke in anticipation of having that responsibility. We must narrow the mission of the Fed first. I don't believe in ending the Fed. I believe we can fix the Fed by getting their mission refocused on monetary price stability, and I have candidates in mind that will help us do
so you
Spoken like a true insider. No, Alan Greenspan was a disaster. Everybody in Washington, liberals and conservatives, said he kept interest rates too low too long. Of course, the solution was lower them even more, and they think that's going to solve our problem. But if I had to name one person that did a little bit of good, and that was Paul Volcker. He at least knew how to end or help, end the inflation. But of course, with my position that I don't think highly of the Federal Reserve, and I think we should have sound money, and we shouldn't have somebody deciding what the interest rate should be and how much money supply we should have. I mean, nobody satisfies me. But certainly Alan Greenspan has ushered in the biggest bubble. And what did we do? We've continued the same thing, doing the same thing. We think the inflation under Alan Greenspan was bad, so we're trying to solve the problem by inflating even further. So Bernanke compounds the problem. He's inflating twice as fast as Greenspan was. And the other area that I believe we have suffered a lot in the last several decades has been the loss of personal liberty. I know there's a lot of different things that happen, but I keep thinking that the most symbolic abuse of our personal liberty of being searched without warrants is the abuse that we have all been conditioned to put up with at our airports. But also it's led to some other silly things. The federal government believes they have to tell you everything to do with your personal life and everything to do with your economic life. You today, and there probably won't be very many in here that might not care personally about this issue, but it's so symbolic. In this day and age that we live in, our government has decided, the federal government has to decide whether or not you're allowed to drink raw milk. Now that's going too far. The solution to so many of our problems can be found in the understanding of personal liberty. Personal liberty is the issue that the founders delivered to us, and we have unfortunately rejected it. We have embarked on deficit financing. We embarked on policing the world. We have embarked on running everybody's personal life, and we have economic crisis because we're spending money we don't have. We have to think of freedom as being one issue. Freedom, your personal liberty, your religious liberty, your intellectual liberty is exactly the same as your economic liberty, and that is all one package. And people should have a right to do with their life what they want, but they do not have the right to come and get bailouts either on a personal basis or on a financial basis with the corporations or the big banks. This is what we were given, and unfortunately, we have been so careless and we have allowed this to slip away. So it is true, this is a generation that has to make a decision. And there's a lot of young people right now that are very excited about looking into this in detail, endorsing the ideas that this Federal Reserve System is a fraud, that we don't need income taxes. We ought to allow young people to opt out of Social Security. So therefore, there's every reason to be optimistic about what is happening if we follow through. The revolution is in ideas. It's a non-violent revolution. But if we do not achieve what we want to achieve in bringing us back to this understanding of liberty, I believe it could lead to some violence in this country. It's already stirring up in the world, because when the goods don't come, the people are going to be very upset. So we have to change the attitude. And it's not like I have to invent it or you have to invent it, because it was given to us. It was given to us. Our liberties were given to us by our Creator, but it was also delivered to us with the best package ever. We were the freest and the most prosperous country. And what do you have now? An attack on your civil liberties. All you have is debt, and we have a perpetual problem with big government. So we do have a tremendous job ahead, but if we look to our traditions and do our hard work, we can restore the greatness of America. That is my goal. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this bill. I was opposed to the Patriot Act in 2001 and do not believe now that it's a good idea to extend it. You know, the Fourth Amendment is rather clear. It says that we should be secure in our papers, our persons, our homes, and our effects. And that if warrants are to be issued, we have to do it with probable cause and describe in particular the places, the people, and the things that we're going to look at. And I think what has happened, though, over the years has been that we have diluted the Fourth Amendment. It was greatly diluted in 2001, but it started a lot earlier than that. When the FISA law was originally written in 1978, that really introduced the notion that the Fourth Amendment was relative and not absolute. And later on, it was further weakened in 98, and then, of course, in 2001. I think our reaction to the horrors of 9/11, we can understand the concern and the fear that was developed, but I think the reaction took us in the wrong direction, because the assumption was made, of course, that we weren't spending enough money on surveillance, and even though then our intelligence agencies received $40 billion, they didn't give us the right information. So now we're spending $80 billion. But it also looks like the conclusion was that the American people had too much privacy. And if we undermine the American people's privacy, somehow or another, we're going to be safer. I think another thing that has come up lately has been that the purpose of government is to make us perfectly safe. Now, it is good to be safe, but governments can't make us safe. I question whether or not we have been made safer by the Patriot Act. But let's say a law makes us somewhat safer. Is that a justification for the government to do anything they want? For instance, if you want to be perfectly safe from child abuse and wife beating, the government could put a camera in every one of our houses and our bedrooms, and maybe there would be somebody made safer this way, but what would you be giving up? So perfect safety is not the purpose of government. What we want from government is to enforce the law and to protect our liberties. This, to me, has been, especially since 9/11, a classical example of sacrificing liberty for safety and security. Now, I didn't invent those terms. They've been around a long time, and it's easily justified, and I can understand it because I was here in 2001 when this came up, and people become frightened. The American people want something done, but I think this is misdirected and not it doesn't serve our benefits. So I think at this time we should really question why we're extending this. We're extending the three worst parts. why were these sunsetted? Because people had concern about them. They weren't sure they were good pieces, and maybe they were overkill, and therefore they were saying, we better reassess it. So what have we done? We have already extended it twice, and here we're going to do it again with the intent, I think, in a year to reassess this. But this bill doesn't make things worse. It doesn't make anything better, but it does extend what I consider and others consider bad legislation. I ask for a no vote on this legislation.